Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the 15th annual Salem Lit Fest. I'm Diane Stern, a member of a terrific team of volunteers and Salem Athenaeum and Salem Public Library staff who bring you this festival each year. I'm your moderator for the panel that we call Found in Translation, especially for readers and writers who appreciate books by non-English speaking authors. Just imagine, if you will, if Elena Ferrante's Neapolitan series or Haruki Murakami's books or Victor Hugo, the French author, or for that matter, the Bible were not translated into English or Spanish or whatever your native tongue. Hold that thought. Before introducing our authors, let me give you a quick overview of how this hour will work. We have an anti-harassment policy at the top of the chat, just so you know the rules up front. Of course, we don't expect any problems with you readers, but we also want you to know how important it is to us that you feel safe and comfortable and relaxed. Many of you know all about Zoom by this point, but we have a few tips. Please put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll do our best to answer them after our authors have finished their conversation. If you're an author whose work has been translated, we would love to hear from you as well. Brief comments can be put in the chat, and if you need or want closed captioning, just click on the CC box that's located on your screen. And now to our author translators. Jennifer Croft translates from Ukrainian, Argentine Spanish, and Polish. With one of the most translated Polish authors, Olga Tokarczuk, Jennifer was awarded the 2018 Man Booker International Prize for her translation of Flights, which in turn was translated into a dozen languages. In 2020, Jenny received the William Saroyan International Prize for writing for her auto-fictional memoir, Homesick. Tonight, of course, she'll be talking about her book, The Extinction of Irina Ray, written by a real-life translator, about a group of fictional translators and their adventures in a primeval forest in Poland. And Jenny joins us tonight from Oklahoma. Hannah Weber is a German-Canadian writer, translator, and book reviewer who's a member of the National Book Critics Circle. She's reviewed The Extinction of Irina Ray, no surprise there. Hannah has published in World Literature Today and Words Without Borders, just to name a few. She writes predominantly about literature in translation, especially by women. And when not writing about books, she writes about post-communist states, politics, and travel, and sometimes all three at once. Hannah is an accomplished photographer, and she lives on the south coast of England, and she is joining us from a time zone where it is midnight. So thank you so much for filling up on caffeine and agreeing to join us tonight so late. Welcome to you both. Jenny, let's start with a brief synopsis of The Extinction of Irina Ray. I should tell you, a member of the LitFest committee just listened to the book and she loved it. She says, it's fantastic and weird.
Yeah, that has been very consistent in the reviews. So I think the plot is not exactly weird for the most part. It's about 8 translators who gather together in the primeval forest, which really exists on the Poland-Belarus border. It's the last remaining European original forest. So it's a very special place. It really brings out the wildness in everyone, and perhaps partly for that reason, their author disappears before they can really begin translating her magnum opus. But the book is narrated by the Argentine translator of this author, who has decided to write her narrative in Polish, not her native language, and then it's translated for us by her arch nemesis, who is the Arkansas-born English language translator of that same author. So there's a lot of back and forth in footnotes and in the main text, and it's really the story of this ongoing duel between these two women, and also just the opposition between two very different strategies of translation, which also has to do with kind of how we view the other versus the self, and kind of broader philosophical issues.
And their adventures really go awry, as people who've read it have found out. It's just, whoops, there goes my iPad. Hello. I wonder, as I was reading it, I was wondering how much of this came from real life.
None of it really came from real life. So honestly, every translator I know is like the nicest person I know. It's just such a supportive community. And I was interested in writing nonfiction about translators who are working on the same author, just to kind of think about what else they have in common besides that writer. So if you got rid of the writer, what would their relationship be like? And then I also was interacting with a lot of artists and writers at residencies, programs that are popular, especially in the US, like McDowell and Yaddo. And their behavior tended to be a bit more eccentric, let's say. So I put them in this wild forest to allow them to go wild and also kind of tap into that ego that I feel like actually a lot of translators don't really seem to be super tapped into. So I don't know any translators who resemble the translators in this book, which might come as a relief to any translators listening.
I should think so. So it's more collaboration than competition, you would say.
Yeah, that's absolutely what I have always found, definitely. Whereas writers can be a bit more competitive, artists can be a bit more competitive. there's this urgency that comes with originality or the pretense of originality, which doesn't really seem to happen with translation.
Mhm. Hannah, how does translation even come about? How does the ball get rolling on any given book?
Um, well, for me, and the first time I translated something and published it, it came about because I had read something that moved me in a newspaper. It was just a column, um, maybe 1,000 words. And I really wanted my friends to read it, and I wanted my partner to read it. And my partner doesn't read German. So I had no choice but to translate it because I wanted to discuss this work with other people. And I mean, that's where all translation comes from. It's just you want somebody else to be able to understand and discuss with you this thing that's moved you in a certain way. And I think if you're starting out, there's a lot of translators out there who are working as kind of advocates for the authors that they love. You're trying to convince publishers, hey, this is really good, and I would like other people to read it. And then I was going to ask Jenny this actually. At what point do you feel like you move from the advocate or the person who's trying very hard to get publishers to trust that this is a great thing and you want it to get published to, I don't want to use the word influencer, but almost an influencer, where it's like particularly if you're translating from a smaller language like Polish in the sort of Anglosphere, is it now that you've published alongside Tokarczuk, anything that Jenny Croft is translating out of Polish will get picked up now? And do you kind of get to
Definitely not.
choose what comes out of their literary world, you know?
Yeah, I know what you mean. I mean, I think that burden of choice exists still in so many non-European languages. And I do think it's more of a burden than a privilege. But
Mm.
I haven't found that. I was kind of hoping that that might happen to me at some point, but it hasn't. Um, it still takes the same amount of effort to convince someone to publish an unproven foreign language author in the United States.
Yeah. Yeah, I've actually noticed that where I read a brilliant book by Victor Heringer last year, and it did brilliantly and was published in the US. And his second book has been published over here in the UK, but they just can't find a US publisher. And it's devastating, really, because the market is there, the readers are there. It's just a brilliant work. And yeah, just it seems like it's a trickier market to break into. Even the difference between the US and the UK, and that might just be a geographical reason rather than anything else. But
Does the
Yeah,
original, oh, I'm sorry. Uh,
no, I was just going to say quickly that I think that's even the case for works written in English. There are so many UK writers, and I was just in Sydney and hearing this from Australian writers that, they're super successful for literary fiction anyway in Australia, and they cannot find a publisher in the US. It's just, I feel like editors can still be very restrictive about what they think American audiences might understand. And I don't think that that is in fact true at all. I think American audiences are pretty hungry for the wider world. But sorry, Diane, you were
I
saying.
would agree. No. So does the original author of the book have a say over which translators to use, or did they convince the publishers this needs to be translated into a language and I recommend such and such?
I think that generally, if an author doesn't want a particular translator to work on something, they would certainly have the right to say no. Most often, they wouldn't know whether if I were being translated and if I am being translated into Arabic, I don't know who the best English language translator for Egypt would be. So you can't know every possible language and every possible market. But sometimes, translators and writers who have been working together for a long time, you do kind of rely on the author to insist on things that maybe the publishers don't care to hear from the translator. So they certainly, authors are the most important allies for translators.
I think it's really interesting to see how different authors approach it differently. Like Murakami, for instance, is known to be very involved with translations and to encourage an almost like adaptation like rather than direct translation approach, particularly earlier on, 2 decades ago, advocating for, okay, we can shift this even a little bit into something that an American audience might be able to relate to better. So it's more of an adaptation than a direct translation. And then you've got, I think, Diane, you asked me this before when we first spoke, the case of what if you're translating an author that's no longer around? So is it easier to translate a dead author than an author that might, I don't know, have an opinion on the work that you're doing or be able to help you? And this was a question that actually came up. I went to a panel that they were talking about Victor Heringer, who very sadly passed away quite young, and so only has these 2 works. And the sad thing about that, where someone asked, is it easier to work, ask the translator, is it easier to work with a dead author because you don't have any back and forth? And he kind of said, well, it's such a shame because you're looking at a person's early works and you just see like this whole everything they possibly could have written after that they're not going to get the chance to do. And on the other hand, you're totally freed from the author's intent. So whatever your interpretation is, you can kind of go with that, and there's no one to say, actually, I meant this.
That kind of runs into this question. Has an author ever told either of you, or have you ever heard this happening after a book has been translated and the author says, that's not really what I meant, if they have a knowledge of the language it's been translated into? Because I think once when we were on a WhatsApp call, Hannah, at least a month ago, you said that the industry is largely unregulated.
Well, I can answer quickly because I don't have a full book out, and I was very nervous when I published my first translation, and I had interacted with the publisher because they held the rights to it, but I hadn't interacted with the author, and I was very young and very scared actually of what he might think. So it was this column by Heinz Heller, who's an Austrian writer, and he wrote to me afterwards. And when I saw the email come up, I was like, my heart was beating, but I was, 26, really scared that I had chosen the wrong words or interpreted it in the wrong way or taken the tone and totally changed it. And I found the email because I had been thinking about exactly this question. And he was wonderful about it. And he said, it reminded me once again why I'm moved by the idea of translation, that people take a piece of language, examine it very closely until they understand it so well that they can transfer it into another language. While they create something that is new and original, they nevertheless preserve the tone of the original, the mood or the rhythm, and whatever we want to call what makes a piece of language meaningful to us. And that's my live translation of that. So it's not the most beautiful.
That's actually so lovely, though. I hope you just published that. That's so beautiful.
It's so that was wonderful to hear. And I know that he speaks English relatively well and could have read my piece enough to respond to it. But just understanding, I think most authors understand that translation is writing and appreciate it in that way, rather than saying, this was maybe not my intent, or I really didn't mean it like this. But you might have a different experience, Jenny.
No, I've had similar experiences to yours. I mean, I think it comes down to personality types, and of course, like there are some writers who are very obsessive and neurotic, and they go over like every single word, and that doesn't have anything to do with the translator necessarily. You can have the absolute most precise translator in the world who's a native speaker of both languages, and they still want to kind of like tinker with every line. And then you can have, I think the majority of writers, and certainly everyone I can think of that I've ever worked with, are just really grateful for the gift of translation, and also recognize that it is a kind of independent act, paradoxically, while also being completely tethered to the original book that they wrote. But I think that's part of why it's been so important. There's so many reasons why it's been so important to me to advocate for translators' names being on the cover, but I definitely want people to know that this is the product of two authors. This isn't, the original language author shouldn't be held entirely responsible for the translation and the contents of the translation, because of course, every reading and every translation will be different from the original. So even if it's a great translation, there will be other great translations that sound quite distinct.
Kind of gets back to what you said about the ego, like the translators you can't go into it with an ego. You're there to present what you've loved about someone else's work.
And yet the recognition factor, do you both feel that translators are not getting their due, considering what a responsibility they have and all the work that they have done?
Yeah, I definitely feel that way. And I think that covers a lot of different things. I think I would advocate in general for more transparency in the publishing industry, including I would like for editors' names to appear somewhere in the book other than the acknowledgements. Because I think obviously editors are also super influential in how the text ultimately turns out. But editors are usually paid like a living wage, and translators really aren't necessarily. So, I think it's going to be much harder to deny translators things like royalties or percentage of the sales of the book if you have their identity a little bit more foregrounded, if you know who they are as a person. And I also think there are some, literary translation has been such a predominantly white field for so long. It's also necessary to talk about identity and where we learn our languages and how we learn our languages, and kind of rethink this necessity of native speaking for translators, which has long been, a very beloved kind of superstition among translators, that you have to grow up speaking English. Like you have to be born into English in order to be a successful translator into English, which I totally disagree with. So I think it just kind of opens up so many avenues for not only increased recognition, but also just acceptance as artists who deserve to be paid and to be listened to, and so on and so forth.
And so how, obviously, Hannah, you're fluent in German and all of your languages, too, Jenny, Polish, Argentine, Spanish, Ukrainian. So you know these languages. So did you have to go to school to learn more about translation or not?
Well, I had to go to school to learn those languages because I grew up here in Oklahoma not speaking anything else besides English. And I taught myself Russian. I was homeschooled for a while here, and I had nothing else to do and was really excited about learning another language with another alphabet. So started with Russian, then learned Polish in graduate school, and then moved to Poland, which is how I really learned to speak Polish. And then I lived in Argentina for 7 years.
Mhm.
And then Ukrainian translations I have studied Ukrainian, but I have never lived in Ukraine. So those have been always in collaboration with either the author or, for example, my husband, who's Ukrainian, but somebody else who can kind of work alongside me and just offer other insights onto the language. But I know, Hannah, your story is very different.
Yeah, so it's I grew up monolingual, and then I met my father for the first time in my late teens, and he was German, and not to have a whole family history, but my mother and father had a very brief liaison, and they never saw each other again until this year, actually. So when I met my father for the first time, I had to learn German to speak with him and my 4 half and step siblings.
This
And
is an amazing novel. I hope you write this.
yeah, it does make a very interesting story. It gets even more interesting when you learn that my parents met working at a traveling Chinese circus in Austria. So it couldn't get
Oh
more
my
weird.
That's
So,
nationalities.
yeah, it's a story that no one, it's kind of truth is stranger than fiction kind of thing. So I learned German relatively late for sort of a native speaker, not a native speaker, but pretty much native fluency at this point. But it was amazing to learn it with a family in a way, because I learned like a baby would in a way, and I had this kind of freedom to get a lot of things wrong and just picking up things around the house. I had met my family there, and then when I finished university, studied philosophy and had read a lot of German in translation, of course, as you do if you're studying philosophy, and then went over there for a few months to start with, and was just learning things because I was having to cook with these people and navigate the streets and all this. And it built up to a point where I was able to get a job in a cafe. And if you ever want to learn a language quickly, don't take a language course, get paid minimum wage, and just be forced to speak to people for 10 hours a day, because that was truly the quickest way for me to become fluent. And yeah, and I just think it's language acquisition is fascinating, and it's so much, it felt more organic. But then, of course, I've had to do a little bit of studying on top of that, and you're learning all the time if you translate something new out of German, because the German that I then learned, German has a lot of dialects. So I speak a very particular dialect from a region around the Rhine that suddenly was not incomprehensible, but was certainly laughable in other parts of Germany. So always learning new things if you're not having classroom education in language.
Was that the High German or the Low German? Or do people even use those expressions anymore?
People will say High German about some parts of Germany. What we'd refer to in England as like BBC English,
Oh.
where nobody really speaks it, except for a couple of regions in the north. But there's just so many regional dialects of German, and the written is all pretty much the same. But I remember the first time I went through Austria and had the very perplexing experience of being able to read everything and understand nothing. But honestly, it's the same sometimes in regions in Scotland. So it can happen anywhere.
And with German, and this is another thing we talked about on WhatsApp, the verb comes at the end. So isn't that kind of tricky to translate that so it's flowing and smooth?
Yeah, I think the lovely thing about the verb coming at the end in German is it makes it very difficult to interrupt people. And because you don't know what they're going to say until they've gotten to the end of their sentence. But then, like any other language, it comes with some difficulties of how do I translate the cadence of and the rhythm of what this author is saying, because you can't just plunk the verb on the end of of a sentence in English. Or if you've got an author who really wants to draw it out and keeps you waiting until the end, you have to be a little bit creative in how you want to do that in English, because English is a lot more straightforward. It's not as straightforward as certain other Romance languages that just have the verb up front and drop a lot of the other fluff. But yeah, I'm interested actually in, because I'm sure Polish and Argentine Spanish are worlds apart in the way that they arrange their sentences and how different it is to translate when you're working on those two languages.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still interested in that question of word order, and I tried to play around with that in my first book, but in a playful way, not in a like frightening way that would destabilize the reader too much and they would kind of turn away from it. But um, yeah, I remember reading a really interesting book by Sam Weber, who pronounces his last name Weber. Just don't get offended by that. About Walter Benjamin's abilities. It's called Walter Benjamin's abilities. So translatability being one of the main areas of focus. And thinking about Benjamin's idea of the way of meaning. And I actually don't, I really would, that German is the language that I would most like to learn. But I don't speak German. So I don't know what the original of that was. But there's a famous essay by Walter Benjamin on called The Task of the Translator in English. And he talks about the way of meaning. And so Sam Weber interprets that as syntax. So the way to kind of be truest to the original is to retain as much as possible of the original word order. And I just find that to be such an interesting challenge and potentially so productive in expanding the horizons of English, which has such a rigid word order because we have not retained the kind of grammar that Polish really has, and I think German has to some extent, which is basically the case system. So nouns change their endings according to what role they're playing in the sentence. So it doesn't really matter if I say like, I'm petting the cat or the cat is petting me, you still know what's happening based on the ending of the nouns. And I'm sure that that is even more the case in other languages. Like I think that's more the case in Turkish and I'm sure many others, Hungarian. But yeah, what do you do with that? That allows so much flexibility and so much subtle shifts in emphasis in Polish, for example, that are really hard to capture in English. And you have to find a different way to compensate for that loss, unless you really want to be like very radical. And I think if you actually kept word order, you would definitely lose 99% of your readers.
Yeah, it's really it's interesting because it makes me think of like not to the same extent, but the two main characters in The Extinction of Irina Ray have very different approaches, and the Argentine Spanish translator, who is technically the author, this is for someone who's not, if anyone's not read the book, it becomes very difficult to show you this sort of nesting doll of writer translators. But she's so devoted, both emotionally and professionally, to the author and translating everything absolutely correctly. Where she'll take a word that's meaningless and really, really try to dig in and try to find it, and you're thinking, what if that was just a typo, kind of thing, and
Yeah.
and then you have not quite the flip side of that, but a looser approach where the American translator, the English translator, is more interested, maybe not in preserving the exact syntax, let's say. Or
Yeah.
that's what I took from it.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I am not either of those people, obviously, and I guess I would fall closer to Alexis, the English language translator, but I made her somewhat of a caricature also to kind of highlight the hierarchies among languages that are being translated into and the tendency that I have noticed, including occasionally myself, much to my horror of as she says, trying to civilize language and basically assuming that in the United States, we know how to tell a good story, and anything that isn't that is just bad. It's bad style, it's bad structure. And so the best thing we can do as a translator is also act as an editor. And that is a very free model of translation. So not only are you kind of rewriting it as you go, but you also have this almost, well, indeed, a political program to alter the kind of fundamental structure, essence of the foreign text to make it more palatable to the English language reader, specifically the American reader.
Is it tempting to tweak a book that you're translating, maybe change it a little bit? And maybe in your view that the language is awkward to begin with, and you can clean it up when you translate it? Is that
Yeah.
something you come across?
Yeah, and that's exactly what this character does. I think I also have mostly translated things that I've just kind of fallen in love with and wanted to share with other people. So that has spared me some of that temptation, I think, because in translating writers whom I really admire, it just hasn't occurred to me quite as much to really change what they're doing. I want to emulate what they're doing as well as I can, rather than trying to change it. But it definitely, occasionally crosses my mind.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's funny to see that in the book as well. And there's a point at which Alexis, the English translator, there's a footnote that says something along the lines of, it's an asterisk to a word and says, here I've kept her ridiculous word, or I've stayed true to it, or something. And you can see the translator being frustrated with the author's word choice. And I thought about it because I'm translating a series of essays by a German writer called Mea Im, and she unfortunately passed away quite young when she was 25, about a decade ago now, or longer. I'm losing track of time. It's COVID has just shortened everything. and this essay is so beautiful when I read it, but I can't get the first sentence right because it's just awkward. Like, it's just an awkward sentence. And I wish that an editor before publishing it had tweaked it a little bit, had pointed it out. And it seemed like it just slipped through. And when I read that footnote in The Extinction of Irina Ray, I thought, gosh, there's this temptation to footnote my translation of this sentence to say, it's awkward because it was awkward in the original. It's not awkward
And
because
not
I
my
haven't
fault.
translated it right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and I think about books that are intentionally awkward or intentionally written in like a not necessarily bad style, but I'm teaching right now Hernan Diaz's book Trust, which I think won the last or the penultimate Pulitzer Prize. And that's basically 4 books in one, and the first 2 are supposed to be less rich, less sophisticated than the second 2. And the second book in particular is supposed to sound pretty obnoxious. And so, yeah, I wonder if that must be a really frustrating experience as a translator. I know he himself has said that it was frustrating to write. But as the translator, you sign the contract for the Pulitzer Prize winning book, and then you get into it and you come to this section that is just kind of like deplorable. And I think in a lot of cases it might be difficult to resist the footnote or resist taming it a little bit, but it depends on the project, I guess.
With even that footnote, people always say, oh, the translator's not, if you notice the translator, they're not doing their job very
Right.
well. And in putting that footnote in, the character of this English translator is trying to be honest in a way and be truthful, but it kind of makes her feel less trustworthy that she's commenting on the text and making herself visible as a translator. So it's really interesting to see.
This reminds me of praise for a translator, a German English translator, Michael Hoffman, who translated Kairos by Jenny Erpenbeck. And he was praised for, and this is a quote, achieving what translators are supposedly unable to do. Right. His translation is at once loyal and beautiful, end quote. Any reaction to that? I mean,
That's
it's
horrifying.
Yeah.
Who said that?
And I'm trying to, I don't
I
have
can
it right
Google
here.
later.
Yeah, I think you'll be able to find it. But this the German English translator is Michael Hoffman, and this was someone else who was commenting on his translation.
Yeah.
And I thought, gee, what a slam.
Yeah, that's not very nice at all. I mean, I really love his translations. They're beautiful, but they're also quite strange. Don't you think, Hannah? I don't know if you've read
Funny
them.
because I only read her in English rather than in German, and that's just by fluke because people kept buying me her books for the Christmas and birthdays, and then I just read them in the language that was lying around my house rather than rather than the German. So I'd like to go and actually see. I can tell you if it's loyal, although loyalty to the original text is in the eye of the beholder anyway. And usually reviewers, as I mean, I predominantly review books actually, and usually reviewers don't speak both languages, don't read both languages of the book that they're reviewing. So you're you're assessing something with a different set of criteria that doesn't usually involve loyalty or faithfulness to the original text. It's more about when something sounds unnatural, and and when a translator has used an interesting or beautiful or unique or original turn of phrase, and it's not my job to go digging to see if it was as interesting, beautiful, unique in the original.
Have
If that
either
makes
of you translated poetry? And is that an entirely different kettle of fish?
I've translated only a little bit of poetry. My husband translates a lot of poetry, and he's a formal poet himself. So he thinks all the time in like rhymed verse, which I find very bizarre. So he's absolutely brilliant at doing that. I think um, I really read fiction. I devour fiction. I've always preferred fiction. And so I think it would be inorganic for me to translate poetry, although when I have done it, it's been again in collaboration with the poet, kind of like with the Ukrainian, where I feel like I'm not quite natural in that language, in the poetic language. So I need to do it with someone else. And that can be really lovely as an experience, but I'm not a poet.
Mm.
And I've translated I have translated poetry. I I find it not more difficult because I think the people I'm drawn to translate use poetic language anyway, or use less conventional ways of writing. Um, but I do think translating poetry, you have to consider some different things, and it's about musicality. And certainly, I've never tried to translate something that rhymed because I just don't think I'm up to the task because you're just then you really do have to be quite creative with things. But it was a translation of poetry that got me interested in translation anyway. And I think Diane, we spoke about this when we spoke on the phone the first time, was when I realized it was important was when I showed up at a university course in my first year of university with the wrong translation of the Odyssey. Everyone had this Penguin edition from the early 90s. I can't remember who translated it. And I had the Robert Fagles edition from the late 90s. And they all started to read, and I wrote down the difference is enormous. So you've got this old Penguin edition that says, "Tell me, muse, of that resourceful man who was driven to wander far." And it sort of continued on this like plinky plonky, everything very straight and precise. And then the Robert Fagles edition just was so much richer. And he started with "Sing to me of the man, muse, the man of twists and turns, driven time and again off course," and continued in this far more musical and evocative voice. And I think that's more important when you're looking at poetry. If the poet has this kind of voice, you have to emulate it, even if it means, switching making your word choices a little bit more unconventional.
I think there's just so much more to it than people realize. There are just so many considerations that you have to think about. We touched on this a little bit before. Some books aren't translated until decades later. The Copenhagen trilogy memoirs were finally translated into English from the Danish. And now the trilogy is on the New York Times Best 100 Books of the 21st Century. So all these years, we haven't had that. It's on my book list. I haven't read it, but it makes you wonder how many fabulous books are out there and yet not accessible to English readers. And talk about American readers, there are very few. Um, uh, this was also in the New York Times, a book review. Literature and translation makes up a small fraction of popular fiction in the US. Why do you think that is? I mean, there's just so much richness out there that we're not seeing.
You want to go first, Jenny?
I defer to you.
Uh-oh.
uh, Again, I think there's a bit of a misconception. People don't realize how much translated literature they have read. As we were talking about before we started this call, when I just gave that example of me realizing how important the translation and the translator was. But I had certainly read translations before that. I read Camus in high school, and then all the way back to probably the first translation I read when I was sent to Sunday school was the Bible. And there are very many, many different translations of that. So I don't know if it's the more we put it in focus, the more people go, oh, I'm unsure about that. But then it's linked up with, if we think about it, like it's linked to colonialism also. So if we think about the fact that loads of literature in English is translated into smaller languages and pushed into smaller languages, and the world population as a whole, if we were reading sort of a representative syllabus in our lives, how is it that I can count on one hand the number of authors that I have read from the Indian subcontinent in languages other than English? Or I realized that I had read for the very first time last year a book that had been translated from Mandarin, which is one of the biggest languages in the world. So yeah, I think geopolitics has a lot to do with that for sure. And I don't know if we're getting more monolingual with time. That's probably incorrect.
I hope
But
not.
yeah, I don't know, but certainly seeing how the education system works here in the UK, where second languages are being steadily dropped and dropped and dropped. And it was the same when I was growing up in Canada, that, even 10 years before I was going through the high school system, French immersion was a much bigger offer, that kind of thing. So I just think, along with the rest of the humanities, language is just not being prioritized.
Right.
I think there's a lot of reasons, though, that go into that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jenny, do you want to weigh in on that at all?
No, I completely agree with everything you just said. I'm not sure if I have. I mean, I think it's ultimately the result of so many almost arbitrary factors that have come together over a very long period of time. Cultural factors and political factors, and just purely like logistical, practical factors. Um, yeah, it's hard to explain. I do think there's still a little bit of resistance to translation itself, in addition to some of what you just described. And there's still this kind of romantic notion of the genius, of the great authority figure who has these brilliant ideas that might be adulterated in some way by being mediated by translators. So we don't want that. Like, if we can't read this poet in the original, we're just not going to do it, because it's not going to be worth our time, or we're going to get the wrong idea or something. And I think that idea is, in fact, changing pretty quickly for the better. But yeah, I don't know. And then I think like the that problem of no translations existing from the Indian subcontinent. Obviously, it's not nothing, but I just served on the jury for the National Book Awards in Translated Literature with Jhumpa Lahiri, who was chairing the panel. And we had 0 submissions from Indian languages out of all of the very many submissions that we did receive, most of which were from Spanish, French, just kind of the traditional languages. And I think actually the more we expand that, the more popular translations will become as well. Like maybe people have gotten bored with like the same old French translations. Not that there's anything wrong with French literature in any way, but there's so much more out there that's available that, as you say, also like, man, why is Mandarin not being translated more? It seems to be very time consuming because the languages are so different from like pay increase to recognize that fact. So that's part of it, but I'm sure there are many other reasons as well.
I was going to add to that I think part of another element of it is getting an Anglophone reader used to different types of storytelling. So what you were saying before about sort of the American novel, and I remember the first time I read a book that included a lot of Sufi philosophy and was written in this circular way, and where time didn't really exist in the same way, and characters sort of shifted from person to a bee, and it was a completely different type of storytelling. And at first, it was a little bit of work, and then when I got into the rhythm of it, it became quite familiar. And then I was open to reading other books that have the same or a similar format. So the same way that, you know, if somebody really gets into Korean horror is having a big moment at the moment, particularly Korean feminist works. And it's a different style, it's a different narrative format. And once you're in it and you're used to it, you're open to reading more of that. But that means that publishers have to take a couple of what they think are risks and try to get these books in front of people.
Yeah, and I think a lot of really great work is being done with that in English as well. Like Matthew Salesius's Craft in the Real World is a really beautiful study of different story structures and how they've kind of been kept out of the MFA system in the United States, but how they could really enrich our own literary tradition, regardless of language. So, yes, Diane.
If we could open this up to a few questions as we're coming up to the top of the hour. Oh, we still have 10 minutes, but the first one is from Trisha. She wonders, what are the best ways to find works in translation? Is it always obvious on a cover that a book has been translated?
It is definitely not always obvious on the cover that the book has been translated. Sometimes you got to dig through the first couple of pages to find out. Yeah, I think there's a lot of really brilliant small publishers that are doing all the legwork here. So
Indie presses, sort of thing.
yeah, indie presses. And then once you started out being indie presses and have gotten a lot bigger. So if it's Geraldo, for instance, who published a lot of Tokarczuk's work, so what Jenny's worked on, they do a lot of work that's in translation. And Archipelago is another one that have really, really done well with that. And I think once you find a publisher that does that, you know that you're getting good work coming out of them. And then ask your local bookseller, because booksellers really know their stuff. And I have a lot of friends who are booksellers who are reading what's up and coming or what's interesting, and reading outside the lines, I guess, of what's, you know, usually in the bookshop window. So they're always open to that kind of thing. And try to read just sort of, you know, you can search for it, read from a language you've never read before, and maybe you won't like it, and maybe it's not going to be necessarily indicative of that literature as a whole, but you may find something interesting.
Yeah,
Um,
I think there's so
go
many
ahead.
good resources, including booksellers. And if you don't have a great local indie, then potentially go to social media. There are a lot of booksellers who are really outspoken about their favorite books in translation. There's a new prize created by booksellers and judged by booksellers called the Cercador Prize, Cercador. Literary prize lists in general. The National Book Awards this year, I think it's a great list. The International Booker Prize, and certainly the judges, they're aware of bringing in less translated languages as much as possible. So, and also, little things like the New York Times runs these reading a certain city through the eyes of a local, and they recommend like a lot of, like Samantha Schweblin just did one for Buenos Aires, and she recommends a lot of great Argentine fiction. So I think there are many ways to find it. And also, I think included in this question was like whether we could be guided by particular translators' choices. So yeah, I think if you find a translator you like, Anton Hoare is part of that like excitement about Korean literature that you mentioned. And he has amazing taste and he's an amazing translator. So just read everything he does.
Yeah, and there are also just to add, there's resources like Words Without Borders, who I review for, an asymptote journal which publishes really, really brilliant work in translation. So there are people out there who will do the legwork for you, sifting through everything and telling you what's good and what you should have on your radar, which is fantastic.
We have another question. Jennifer, what is the name again of the person writing about non-Western story structures?
Oh, let me type it.
And can you put that in the chat?
Yeah.
Oh, great. And while you're doing that, Marcia said that you mentioned translators aren't paid a living wage. Is there any thought of unionizing? Do you think that would ever come about, that translators, well, I mean, that would be a worldwide effort, I suppose, but is there a way to remedy that?
I feel like it would be great if it was like like the screenwriters union that had very productive, good action happen in the past couple of years.
Mhm.
But then I guess the worry, and we haven't mentioned it, but like the worry then is that if people wanted things to be translated, they just plunk it into some AI program and stop paying translators altogether.
Yes, interesting. You should bring that up. The future of translation. I know audiobook narrators are fearing for their jobs because of AI, but I would imagine translators are kind of thinking about that too. Or are there instances where AI is a welcome tool for translators? I could see it working, positively and negatively, but in terms of just kind of wiping out a job, have you given a lot of thought to that?
I haven't given any thought to it wiping out the job. I don't think it's any likelier to wipe out translation than it is to wipe out writing. And there is so much fascination around like who can write a story better, AI or a person, and that's like constantly being tested. Curtis Sittenfeld just did this again in the New York Times. Yeah, I mean, I think this will happen, that we won't be able to distinguish between a story written by X author and a story written by a computer, potentially. And so I think the question is like a lot deeper than can AI eventually translate as well as a person. It has to do with kind of the fundamental nature of art, why we produce art, why we consume art. And I can't really answer those questions, but I'm not worried about my job. And I do think, as you say, Diane, that it is a pretty useful tool. I mean, it's unimaginable to me to think that people used to translate without the internet. I use Google constantly that I do also in writing. And I think, Google Translate can really, if I get stuck, that can often provide a really good idea. And if I don't use exactly what it suggests, like maybe it just kind of, like makes me think of something else. It's like brainstorming with someone in a way.
Right. Hannah, your thoughts about AI?
Yeah, I think it will end up being a very useful tool. I think things that don't require any kind of artistic input. So let's say a manual on how to do something that would be very easy to put into an AI translator and have somebody proofread it. Of course, there's got to be this sort of human look to make sure everything is actually accurate. But then you'll get to the point where, like when I read out the different translations of the same work, right, where every word that an AI would choose is also, well, it's a choice, and they're just doing it based on a pattern and what is maybe the most likely word. Not, I don't think we're ever going to get to a point where a computer program, like an algorithm, can take into account musicality and cultural context, and perhaps you've just repeated that word from a previous paragraph and you don't want to do that because it gets a little bit clunky. Like, to keep all of these things in mind, it would have to be pretty remarkable algorithm. And then you'd kind of run the risk of, when I was first translating things and I was trying to stay too faithful to the text, and you want every word to be exactly precise, and then it's just flat. There's no life in it. So yeah, I don't think we need to spend too much time worrying about any kind of artist being replaced, but some of their work might get quicker. Just
Right.
being able to use these tools, it's quicker to
Right.
plug something into Google than it is for me to log out my thesaurus, for instance, which I'm super grateful for.
Exactly. Well, I want to thank you both so much for being part of LitFest 2024, which is continuing. I'll get to that in a moment. A shout out to our sponsors, if we may, and supporters and partners who help us to keep the LitFest free. The Salem Athenaeum, the Salem Public Library, Salem Cultural Council, Wicked Good Books, the House of the Seven Gables, Salem Maritime National Historical Site, Essex National Heritage, Theater in the Open, Leonardo Audio, Molecule Literary Magazine, Salem 5, Salem State University Berry Library, Salem Academy Charter School, Peabody Essex Museum, and to readers like you who donate to the festival to keep it free for others. The Salem Lit Fest continues through Sunday, tomorrow evening in person at the House of the Seven Gables in Salem, an event called Enduring Hawthorne, which should be really fun. Saturday is chock full of in-person sessions and events for all ages, including children, culminating in an ensemble of audiobook narrators at Gulu Cafe in Salem. SalemLitFest.org has the full list, and it's not too late to sign up for any of what's ahead, including One Book, One Salem. It's our community read project. On Sunday afternoon, Pulitzer Prize winner Indian Wu's Master Slave Husband Wife. And if you'd like to buy The Extinction of Arena Ray or any of the books featured at our festival, do check out our sponsor, Wicked Good Books in Salem, or your favorite bookseller. Thanks again, Jenny, to you and to all the translators out there who have enriched our lives. And let's hope we have more translated works and that we don't have to wait 50 years for someone's work that's brilliant to actually come to us. So again, many thanks. And to our audience for your support and your questions. Have a good evening, everybody. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Diane.